Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hao Huang, Associate Professor of Social Sciences, and welcome to the Illinois Tech Social Sciences Great Problems, Great Minds seminar series. For today's seminar, we will open the floor to the questions at the end after the talk and lecture. Today's speaker, Petr, Pavlinek, a professor in the Department of Geography and Geology in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. His research and publications focus on the regional development impacts of foreign direct investment, especially in less developed countries and regions, with a particular interest in the development and the restructuring of the automotive industry. Regionally, he has focused on Europe and especially on East Central Europe. He has published 4 books. His 5th book, entitled Europe's Auto Industry, Global Production Networks and Spatial Change, will be published by Cambridge University Press this year. Dr. Pavlinek has also published more than 16 research articles and book chapters on various topics related to the automotive industry, FDI, and regional economic development. His latest article, published in Economic Geography in December 2023, has introduced the concept of geopolitical decoupling in global production networks and focused on the development of the automotive industry in Iran. The funding for his research has come from the United States Department of State, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Zach Science Foundation, the European Commission, the Ministry of Education used in the sports of the Czech Republic, and the International Research and Exchanges Board. Dr. Pavlinek has earned a PhD in geography from the University of Kentucky and a master's degree in natural sciences from the Chinese University. It's very glad to have Dr. Pavlinek, since I'm impressed by his presentation in the panel session I organized in IIT a few years ago. So I'm very looking forward to his talk today.
Okay, thank you for the introduction and thank you for having me. So the topic of my talk is foreign direct investment in less developed countries and peripheral regions. And I will start with talking about the increased importance of FDI in the world economy. Then I will focus a little bit more on less developed countries. Then I will discuss how foreign direct investment is explained by different approaches. Basically, I divide these into mainstream and heterodox perspectives. And in the third or fourth part, I'll focus on foreign direct investment in less developed or peripheral regions of more developed countries. And I will try to explain the mechanisms behind FDI, especially the difference between core and peripheral regions. I'll talk about horizontal and vertical FDI and the importance of FDI linkages and spillovers. And in the last part of my lecture, I will talk about how economic geographers approached the research on foreign direct investment in peripheral regions. And I'll specifically talk about 4 perspectives in the past 50 years the branch plant economy and truncation, the new international division of labor and spatial divisions of labor approaches, new regionalism and territorial embeddedness of FDI, and I will conclude with the global production networks perspective on foreign direct investment. And of course, I will conclude my lecture with a conclusion. But let me start with this, I think, very important question of why should economic geographers study foreign direct investment? And I will answer this question with 3 quotes from economists. The first one reads, the attraction of FDI constitutes a central component of the development strategies of most developing and emerging economies. This is by Jordan from 2020. The second quote is by Accus, and it reads, FDI is perhaps one of the most ambiguous and least understood concepts in international economics. And the third quote is from the book by Moran et al., and it says, determining exactly how FDI affects development has proved remarkably elusive. Basically, these 3 quotes suggest 2 things. First, that foreign direct investment, or FDI, has been extremely important in the development strategies of most developing and emerging economies. But at the same time, we do not really know very much about how FDI actually works in these less developed countries. And it is one of the most ambiguous and least understood concepts, and understanding of FDI and how it affects development is not really 100% clear. So I think these are very important reasons why economic geographers should also study foreign direct investment and its effects in less developed countries and less developed regions, or peripheral countries and peripheral regions. And I will start my discussion with some facts. And one of the most important facts is that foreign direct investment has become extremely important in the world economy. I have already mentioned in one of those quotes that it is one of the central strategies, development strategies in less developed countries, and it has become part of these strategies increasingly since the 1960s in less developed countries, and also in peripheral regions of more developed countries. But it was not until the 1990s when the importance of FDI in these strategies became really crucial. And we can see this based upon the average global annual FDI inflows that have been gradually increasing since the 1970s, as you can see on the chart here on the right. Let me do this. No. All right, you can see that on the chart here on the right, but it was not until the 1990s that FDI inflows really took off exponentially. And of course, all of you know why this has been the case, right? So in 1989, 1990, centrally planned economies basically collapsed. State socialism collapsed in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And these countries started to transition to capitalism. At the same time, in the early 1990s, countries such as China and also India and other countries basically opened up to foreign direct investment and gradually and quite rapidly integrated into the world economy. So great opportunities opened up for transnational corporations to invest in many of these countries. And as more than 3 billion people were brought into the world economy. And we can see this in the trend of rapidly increased FDI in the 1990s. Now, just to compare this growth, you can see that in the decade, on average, the average global annual FDI inflows in the latest decade, between 2013 and 2022, were 63 times higher than in the 1970s. In less developed countries, these average FDI annual inflows were greater 115 times in the last decade compared to the 1970s, and 41 times higher in more developed countries. Also, in the past 50 years, the share of less developed countries on these FDI inflows increased from about 1/4 to almost 1/2. We can see this increased importance of FDI in the world economy also in the average global annual FDI inward stocks, which increased 64 times in the world as a whole between 1970 and 2022. And there were 70 times higher in more developed countries and 50 times higher in less developed countries. So this suggests, obviously, that foreign direct investment has become much more important in the world economy, and that it is really important to analyze FDI and understand its effects in host economies. And for economic geographers, it's also very important to understand how FDI contributes to uneven development. There has been also a great variation in the importance of FDI across the world and in less developed countries. So, if you look at the table on the right here, which shows the FDI inward stock by world region in 2022, you can see that more developed countries account for about 2/3 of the global inward stock, and developing countries account for about 1/3. And among these developing economies, a great share of foreign direct investment inward stock is concentrated in Asia. And we can see it on this chart on the left. East Asia in 2022 accounted for 40%, Southeast Asia for 23.5%. So together it's about 2/3. These two regions of less developed world account about for 2/3 of FDI inward stock, followed by Latin America and the Caribbean with 17%, and then Africa with 7%. So very uneven distribution of FDI in less developed countries. So basically, foreign direct investment is important and has become much more important in the past about 35 years. Now, if we look a little bit further back, since the beginning of the 20th century, the story has been more or less the same in terms of much smaller FDI flows and stocks in less developed countries than in more developed countries. But increasingly, FDI has been kind of important already at the beginning of the 20th century. For example, in Latin America, especially Brazil, which had the largest inflows in East and Southeast Asia, for example. Japan heavily invested in its colonies before World War II, especially in Korea and Taiwan. Africa had some FDI that was mainly concentrated in extractive industries, but overall FDI stocks were low with the exception of South Africa. It is also interesting to know that during the first half of the 20th century, the value and importance of FDI declined because of wars, world wars, and the Great Depression. And this decline continued after the Second World War because of basically decolonization, which led to the nationalization of extractive industries in less developed countries, and also anti-FDI policies. This was a period of import substitution policies mainly. The situation started to change in the 1960s, and as I already talked about it, the importance of foreign direct investment rapidly increased since the 1990s. And I have also already mentioned the uneven distribution of FDI and the fact that FDI has uneven national and regional effects. And of course, different countries and different governments have different policies towards foreign direct investment. But I think it's more interesting, or of course, these empirical facts and history are important, but how do we actually understand FDI and how do we think about its effects in less developed economies? Now, it is interesting that the modern theory of FDI and international production was actually developed by economists and not economic geographers. And it was the economists who actually applied spatial perspective to think about FDI and international production. And this modern theory of international production was developed in the 1960s and 1970s. I'll mention three important names. There are more, of course, many more. You probably heard about Stephen Heimer, who was a Canadian economist who published his PhD dissertation, and which became extremely important for the modern theory of international production. We don't really have time to talk about it here, but one of the things he recognized was the close relationship between FDI and uneven development, what he called the law on uneven development. And you can see it here on the right. Basically, he recognized the kind of a geographical distribution of functions of transnational corporations in different types of regions. And as we can see, the most important functions, such as long-term strategic planning, tends to concentrate in kind of core metropolitan areas, or lower level administration functions, which tend to concentrate in regional capitals, while production will concentrate in peripheral regions. So that was Heimer in the 1960s. Raymond Vernon was an American economist who linked the internationalization of production to the product life cycle. And then John Dunning developed what he called the eclectic theory of international involvement, and later the ownership location internationalization paradigm. So these economists basically developed the basic conceptual framework for the understanding of foreign direct investment and international activities of transnational corporations, which is still being kind of the most important approach in mainstream economics, international business, and also in economic geography. But there are different views and understandings of FDI in less developed countries. And basically, we can recognize two basic perspectives, what I would call the mainstream perspective and the heterodox perspective or perspectives. And I also recognize dependency and world systems perspectives as two kind of distinct perspectives that would fall under the heterodox perspective category. But let's start with the mainstream perspective and some basic points. The mainstream perspective is very optimistic about FDI in less developed countries. Basically, it argues that FDI leads to economic growth and that it is the precondition for a successful economic development in less developed countries. It basically advocates hands-off approach for the governments. Their role should be limited to basically facilitating FDI, but otherwise the government should not regulate FDI or should not intervene. It argues that FDI leads to technology and productivity spillovers that ultimately benefit the host economy. Foreign corporations create good jobs in host economies for both for the workers and for these host economies. So overall, FDI is beneficial for less developed countries. Of course, the mainstream perspective is based in neoclassical economics and in neoliberal approaches to economic development. So the emphasis here is on free markets, minimizing the role of the government, which would allow for the most efficient distribution and operation of FDI. If there are any problems with FDI, inefficiencies or suboptimal performance, it is always attributed to governmental intervention and regulation. Now, this view of FDI has been incorporated into what we might call the ideology for economic development since the mid-1970s, and it became especially important since the 1990s. This mainstream perspective would basically advise through international institutions, less developed countries to liberalize foreign direct investment, right? So it became the kind of orthodoxy in terms of thinking about FDI. But the question is whether this mainstream perspective is supported by empirical evidence. And it's not really supported by empirical evidence from less developed countries. One reason I would argue is that FDI effects really vary in different countries because they strongly depend on the concrete context of these different countries and different regions. And I have cited two quotes by economists, not economic geographers, about FDI effects in less developed economies. So the first one by Alfaro et al. From 2010 reads, although there is a widespread belief among policymakers that FDI generates positive productivity externalities for host countries, the empirical evidence fails to confirm this belief. In the particular case of developing countries, both the micro and macro empirical literatures consistently find either no effect of FDI on the productivity of the host country firms and or aggregate growth or negative effects. And Arcus again argues in his book, there can be no generalization regarding the impact of FDI on capital formation, technological progress, economic growth, and structural change. Indeed, there is no conclusive evidence to support the myth that FDI makes a major contribution to growth. So the first quote talks about the belief about what FDI does in less developed economies or countries. The second quote talks about the myth that FDI makes a major contribution to growth. So it's not really supported by empirical evidence. So what about the heterodox perspective? It is less optimistic about FDI. So generally, it argues that economic growth attracts FDI rather than the other way around. It acknowledges short-term benefits of FDI, but potential long-term negative effects. So it admits that FDI can be helpful in less developed economies, but only if it is part of well-crafted long-term development strategy. However, the heterodox perspective argues that the dependence on FDI for development is unlikely to lead to successful long-term development. In terms of the government, it advocates for a much more active role of governments than the mainstream perspective. So it argues for a targeted and performance-oriented approach, the regulation of FDI, and strong industrial and FDI policies. Again, it believes that unregulated FDI is harmful for long-term development in less developed countries. Spillovers are not automatic, but depend on these industrial policies, performance requirements, and support of domestic firms, which would increase their absorptive capacity. In terms of jobs, it, of course, agrees that often above average local wages are paid, but with the purpose of poaching of the best workers from domestic firms and maintaining them while wage-adjusted labor productivity is high. And also there are many low-wage jobs that involve poor working conditions. So FDI generally can be beneficial only if well-targeted and regulated within a long-term development strategy. So obviously this heterodox perspective draws on different way of thinking about economic processes, and FDI, it basically draws on institutional and evolutionary economics, but also on the empirical historical evidence. So the basic point is that FDI does not automatically lead to successful long-term economic development in less developed countries. And it emphasizes the importance of industrial policies and the importance of domestic firms for a successful economic development. So countries, less developed countries, should not rely mainly on foreign direct investment for economic development. FDI can have negative long-term effects, especially in terms of resource-oriented FDI, which will lead to the development of foreign-controlled enclaves. This perspective basically argues that FDI will disproportionately benefit source countries of FDI because of the transfer of profits, because they will have access to primary commodities in less developed countries. And overall, FDI has a potential, especially if there's a high dependence on FDI in less developed countries, it will tend to slow down the development of modern industrial capitalism, and it might intensify their foreign exploitation. So the last perspective is the dependency in world system perspective, or perspectives, which are part of this heterodox perspective. And dependency school on the world systems approach are even more critical of FDI in less developed countries. Although, of course, they also acknowledge that FDI may lead to short and medium-term growth and economic development, but in the long run, it will have negative effects for less developed economies, especially if they are highly dependent on FDI. And it is because FDI will lead to the transfer of profits abroad. It will lead to destruction of domestic firms that cannot compete with foreign firms in the same industry, usually, and it will suppress their growth and development. So because of that, these two perspectives would advocate heavy regulation of FDI and limits on foreign ownership, such as foreign ownership ceilings. It would argue that spillovers are minimal because FDI tends to be isolated from host economies, and there are limited linkages with domestic firms. There is high level of labor exploitation, low wages, high pace of work, and poor working conditions. So overall, these two perspectives will argue that negative effects predominate and that FDI is damaging in the long run. And overall, those countries that are more dependent on FDI will grow more slowly than those less dependent, as shown by the historical empirical evidence. But these two perspectives have been criticized for being unable to fully account for what we might call FDI success stories of once less developed countries such as Ireland, Hong Kong, and Singapore. However, we might counter that Ireland and Singapore had strategic industrial policies that were channeling FDI into what they consider strategic sectors of the economy. So they've been heavily regulating FDI. So these are three basic perspectives. Now, how do we account for these very different views of FDI in less developed countries? Well, generally, I think one of the reasons is that they emphasize different time horizons, leading to different conclusions. So the mainstream perspective will focus on short to medium term effects of FDI, which are potentially positive, while heterodox approaches will focus more on long-term effects. I would argue that both these perspectives tend to ignore the spatial variation of these effects across different countries and regions in less developed countries. And of course, as ever, all of you would probably assume FDI-related public debates and recommendations are dominated by various perspectives from mainstream economics, right? Now, so why is this the case? So why most governments in less developed countries view FDI positively? Well, I think there are several reasons that are pretty obvious. This promotion of FDI in less developed countries has become basically an orthodoxy or hegemonic discourse. It is championed by international institutions such as the World Bank, the IMF, and other institutions, the World Trade Organizations, for example. Another reason why the governments in less developed countries would view FDI positively is that they do not really recognize the differences between FDI in more developed countries and less developed countries. And as we will see, FDI tends to have more positive effects in poor, more developed regions than in less developed regions. And also, in terms of the time horizon, FDI might represent potentially a relatively easy and quick policy solution to persistent economic problems. Well, you just open up to FDI, foreign investors come, they build factories, they will employ workers, they will pay wages, and unemployment rate will go down, GDP will go up, exports will increase. This in the short run, these are positive effects. So this kind of approach might be politically preferable in many countries to long-term policies that might have very uncertain outcomes, such as, for example, educational reform or institutional reform. So this might explain why FDI has become kind of preferred strategy of economic development in many less developed countries. But let me now move on and talk about FDI in less developed regions of more developed countries. Basically, we are going to talk about the same thing, just at a different scale. And I'm going to talk about less developed or peripheral regions of more developed countries, because there's been a lot of research done in the past 50 years on these peripheral regions of more developed countries. Now, to continue this discussion about FDI, I think, and maybe I should have said this at the very beginning, we need to understand FDI as being part of the profit-seeking strategies of firms. So in that sense, foreign direct investment is primarily sought for the benefit of the investing firms, not for the benefit of host regions or host countries. And the second important point is that the effects of FDI in host regions, both short-term or direct effects and long-term indirect effects, can be both positive and negative. And I already mentioned that the effects of FDI depend on many different factors, and there are different combinations in different countries, right? So it's very difficult to generalize. And so an important point to make is, in this context, is that there are significant differences between core and peripheral regions with respect to FDI. And it is because that these two types of regions differ in terms of factors that attract and deter FDI. This leads to different types of FDI in core and peripheral regions, and ultimately in different regional development outcomes of FDI. And the basic point I will try to get across is that FDI has a greater potential to benefit core regions than peripheral regions in the long run. Now, this table kind of summarizes the differences between core and peripheral regions in terms of foreign direct investment. So there are different factors that are attracting FDI. Generally, core regions are more developed, of course, are developed. They have larger markets, higher incomes, skilled labor force, greater innovation capabilities. These are more advanced and more technologically advanced and more diversified economies. As such, they have more developed, advanced firms and local suppliers and potential business partners. Core regions have better quality infrastructure. And because they are close to the market, they have lower transportation costs and usually also better quality institutions. So there's a number of advantages. Peripheral regions have different type of advantages that would attract FDI. Labor availability, labor surplus, natural resources, and generally lower operating costs that are based on cheaper factors of production. Wages, real estate, land, commercial rents, local taxes, everything is cheaper than in core regions. Very often there are investment incentives in these peripheral regions to attract FDI. And in some cases, when these peripheral regions are close to core regions, this might also be a factor that would attract foreign direct investment. In factors deterring FDI, basically, it is the opposite for core and peripheral regions. So what was the factor attracting FDI to peripheral regions. The opposite is true for core regions. So everything is more expensive in core regions, which would deter foreign investors or certain type of foreign investors, right? And peripheral regions lack many advantages that basically attract FDI to core regions. And because of that, core and peripheral regions attract different types of foreign direct investment. Core regions tend to attract what we call horizontal or market-seeking FDI, while peripheral regions tend to mostly attract vertical FDI, and two types of vertical FDI: efficiency and resource seeking. As we will see, and I'll talk about it, core and peripheral regions also differ in FDI linkages and FDI spillovers, which are very important in terms of indirect effects of FDI on long-term economic development. So let's clarify horizontal and vertical FDI. Horizontal FDI basically refers to the production of the same or similar commodity in foreign locations by foreign investors. As in the home economy, it is typically a market capture type of investment, which is demand-oriented. And again, it is typical for core regions. Vertical FDI is different in that foreign investors would locate a particular stage of the production process abroad, usually for two reasons. Either to lower production costs or to access particular resource, right, in foreign locations. So it is a supply-oriented type of investment. So there are two basic types: efficiency and resource seeking, that are typical for peripheral regions. There is one additional type, which is known as a strategic asset seeking vertical FDI, which seeks knowledge-based intangible strategic assets in foreign locations. So this is a case when, for example, particular know-how or particular technology is not available in a domestic economy. So foreign investors would basically invest in a foreign economy which has this assets, strategic assets available, with the goal of basically transferring or assimilating these assets in foreign location and transferring them back home into the home economy. So obviously, these strategic assets are not going to be located, or less likely are going to be located, in peripheral regions, and then they're typically can be found in core regions. In terms of FDI and linkages in host regions, we are referring to linkages between foreign subsidiaries and host country firms, domestic firms. And these are extremely important because these are basic precondition for FDI spillovers. And generally, we recognize forward and backward linkages. Backward linkages are supplier linkages, and they are considered to be more important. Now, we can recognize three basic types of linkages: developmental, dependent, and detrimental. Developmental linkages are typical for core regions, and these are linkages between foreign subsidiaries and local firms that are based on long-term relations, collaboration, and partnership. And these development linkages lead to exchange of information, which then increases the chances of knowledge and technology transfers. Dependent linkages are typical for peripheral regions. These are typically short-term, price-based supply relations with the goal to minimize the cost of supplied commodities In this kind of relations or linkages, the transfer or exchange of knowledge and information is very limited, which then limits the chances for kind of the growth and transfer of this technology to domestic firms and their eventual kind of growth and upgrading. There also could be what we call detrimental linkages between foreign and domestic firms, which basically refers to negative effects of foreign subsidiaries on domestic firms, mainly through employment and labor market effects. This can be found in less developed or peripheral regions. Basically, foreign investors, I already talked about it, kind of poaching skilled workers from domestic firms by offering them higher wages. And of course, this has detrimental effects on domestic firms that basically trained these workers that are then being lost to foreign investors. As I already mentioned, these linkages are extremely important because they are a precondition for spillovers from foreign subsidiaries to domestic firms. And these FDI spillovers are considered to be the most important long-term benefit of FDI for host regions, right? Basically, we recognize, and you can see the basic classification of spillovers on this chart. So these are indirect effects of foreign direct investment in host regions or host countries. We recognize the difference between horizontal and vertical spillovers. Horizontal spillovers are unintentional effects on domestic firms in the same industry, while vertical spillovers could be both unintentional and intentional, and they affect local suppliers and customers of foreign subsidiaries via these backward and forward linkages, right? And there are kind of different types. We don't really have time to talk about it, but they're extremely important. But these spillovers actually to take place, they not only depend on the existence of linkages, but they also depend on what is known as the absorptive capacity of these domestic or host country firms, the ability to benefit from technology, know-how being transferred from foreign firms to domestic firms. So if the absorptive capacity is low, then spillovers would not work. Basically, they cannot take place because domestic firms are unable to absorb this more advanced technology or know-how. So let me move. So now that we understand the differences between core and peripheral regions in terms of FDI, and that FDI is generally more beneficial for core regions than for peripheral regions, you can look at how economic geographers have been kind of understanding FDI in these peripheral regions. And I recognize four kind of basic approaches in the past 50 years or so: branch plan economy truncation, new international division of labor and spatial divisions of labor, new regionalism and territorial embeddedness, and finally global production network. So let's have a brief look at these four different perspectives developed in economic geography in turn. So we'll start with branch plan economy truncation, which basically was the way how economic geographers and also economists conceptualize the long-term development effects of FDI in peripheral regions in the 1970s and 1980s in more developed countries, right? And of course, as we already know, this was the period of increasing FDI and in many countries in Western Europe, but also in Canada, for example, foreign investors built factories in peripheral regions, and these factories are known as the branch plants. So generally, these factories specialize in the mass production of simple standardized goods. Yes, they brought capital, they created jobs, but in the long run, they suffer from the outflow of profits and greater propensity to relocate or close during economic crisis. They developed or tended to develop weak supplier linkages with domestic firms because they were importing components and materials rather than buying them from local firms. They were also transferring technology from abroad for production, so this technology was not sourced from these host economies. So economic geographers and economists have been talking about the truncation nature of these branch plants, which basically means that they had kind of very limited linkages with the host economy. They also had very limited kind of higher value added activities, such as research and development. Usually it was kind of concentrated in the home economy. They had also limited or no strategic decision-making functions and limited administrative functions or managerial functions. So the conclusion was that in the long run, these branch plants basically, and the branch plant economy overall limits indigenous technological development in host economies. And the logical conclusion was that a high level of foreign control through externally owned branch plants is detrimental to the long-term economic interests of peripheral regions. In the second half of the 1970s and in the 1980s, a different perspective developed, slightly different perspective developed on FDI, which was drawing on the branch plants and truncation approach, of course, but it was linking these changes at the regional level to the increasing levels of internationalization and the new international division of labor, which was basically the outcome of kind of increasing investment, massive investment by transnational corporations in less developed economies. So the changes in these regions, peripheral regions of more developed countries, were then linked to these kind of broader changes in the world economy that were basically triggered by increasing levels of FDI. So it's been argued by these new international division of labor and spatial divisions of labor approaches that this increased importance of FDI led to increased uneven development, and that these changes in the world economy reflected in this new international division of labor had very specific effects in less developed or peripheral regions in more developed countries. Now, perhaps the most important economic geographer who contributed to the development of this perspective was Doreen Massey, who was a British geographer who published the famous book called Spatial Divisions of Labor, in which she basically pointed out the increased geographical separation of different economic functions in different regions of Britain. So I don't know the higher value added functions, research development, decision making functions being concentrated in London, while peripheral regions had high level of FDI in branch plants. So she explained the underdevelopment in peripheral regions of Britain by their position and functions in the broader national and international economy. So the consequence of FDI for economic development in these peripheral regions was that basically FDI exacerbates regional inequality and it leads to intensified, uneven, and dependent development. So this was late 1970s and then 1980s. In the 1990s, we already know that the FDI flows and FDI stocks increased dramatically and very rapidly in the world economy. And economic geographers during this time became kind of more optimistic, at least some of them, about the kind of long-term effects of FDI. And we're thinking about ways how FDI could be more beneficial in peripheral regions. And the answer to this question was through increased territorial embeddedness of FDI and through increased role of institutions in regional economic development, right? So the argument was that the increased flows of FDI, increased investment and economic globalization might enhance its potential benefits in peripheral regions through its increased embeddedness. And there are different forms of embeddedness. We don't really have time to talk about that, but mostly they have been talking about embeddedness of these foreign firms in local supply networks in peripheral regions. In other words, they're talking about creating more linkages of foreign subsidiaries with local firms in these peripheral regions, which would increase the embeddedness in these local economies and lead to positive kind of regional development outcomes. So they've been talking about the embedded branch plans rather than branch plans. And in those kind of regional supply networks based on domestic firms. And the argument was, if these embedded branch plans are combined with dynamic regional institutions, this would overcome these regional development problems related to the branch plan economy and truncation and lead to successful economic development in peripheral regions. However, the kind of empirical evidence to support these arguments has been lacking. And actually, in the 2000s, many of these supposedly embedded branch plans were closed down or relocated. So it was believed that if these branch plans are embedded, it would also kind of decrease the chance of their closure or relocation, but it actually did not happen, right? Now, it's been argued that this new regionalism and territorial embeddedness failed to adequately consider the role of extra-regional factors in regional development, right? It looked too much into the kind of internal regional assets without considering basically the position of these regions in the broader economy and the international division of labor. Finally, I will briefly talk about the global production networks perspectives and its perspective on foreign direct investment. Global production networks approach has been important since the 2000s, so in the past about 20 years. It has not really focused too much on FDI, but still it kind of built on these previous perspectives to understand FDI in different types of regions. So, as you probably know, the main concern of this perspective has been how and where value is created, enhanced, and captured, and how it affects the potential of different places and regions for economic development, right? And one of the basic arguments is that regional development in host regions is the outcome of what's known as the strategic coupling between regional assets and the profit-driven needs of transnational corporations. And of course, this strategic coupling is usually, or its formation is usually a highly politicized process, depends on favorable institutional environment, which of course is less likely in peripheral regions. Now, overall, the consequences for less developed or peripheral regions have been, in terms of its conclusions of this perspective, has been very similar, right? But along with, I think, these institutional perspectives, it would argue that FDI should be a part of a broader development strategy in which peripheral regions systematically develop regional assets that would attract FDI into high value added activities. So these are typically strategic non-production functions. However, you might argue, if you are talking about less developed regions, peripheral regions, this is really hard to achieve because it requires a long-term and systematic investment into high-quality education, innovation activities, and the development of capable regional institutions. And these are the attributes of core regions, not peripheral regions, right? So it is really, I think, unrealistic to expect that all peripheral regions would be able to follow this strategy. So this concept of strategic coupling is really important. And three types of strategic couplings between host region or regions and transnational corporations are recognized: indigenous, functional, and structural. As you can see down here, indigenous coupling is typical for more developed countries or core regions. Structure coupling is typical for peripheral regions or less developed countries and less developed countries, while functional coupling, which is kind of a in-between position, is typical for emerging economies. So how is FDI kind of related to these different types of couplings, and how can we think about it? So core regions in general are, as we could see right here, are integrated into GPNs or articulated into GPNs through indigenous couplings. Core regions are a source of FDI, so they are typified by outward FDI. Core regions typically host a disproportionately higher or high number of headquarters of transnational corporations, a higher value-added knowledge-intensive activities of these TNCs, research and development, marketing, strategic decision-making, and so on. And these corporate headquarters are based in core regions, basically build power and control over the international dispersed operations of TNCs in peripheral regions, right? So because of transfer of profits and transfer of value and all kinds of profit shifting strategies, transfer pricing, core regions basically have very high value capture. The opposite are peripheral regions. So the peripheral regions are the recipients, typically of vertical FDI that we talked about. They are articulated with GPNs through structural couplings, which are the kind of least advantageous types of couplings with global production networks. We also know that subsidiaries in peripheral regions are established in order to either cut production costs or in order to secure access to natural resources. We also know already that typically these subsidiaries will not have high value-added strategic non-production functions. So all of this contributes to lower value creation. And we also know that these peripheral regions suffer from transfer of profits and basically transfer of value through corporate structures, TNC structures, and of course this value gets concentrated somewhere else, typically in core regions. Then we have semi-peripheral regions that are located somewhere in between, right? Through functional couplings. They have a greater balance between inward and outward FDI, mixture of horizontal and vertical FDI, more developed domestic firms. Some of them are able to invest abroad, greater regional autonomy, less dependency, greater value creation and capture. Okay, I should have gone through this way anyway. Well, this brings me to the conclusion. Now, economic geographers basically have developed these 4 different perspectives, but all of them in one way or another came to similar conclusions about FDI in peripheral regions. Even the greater, territorial embeddedness approach that has been criticized, so the critique of this approach came to these conclusions. We can assume that foreign direct investment, along with other transnational strategies of transnational corporations, will continue to shape economic development in peripheral regions and countries. We can also assume that these developments will be uneven, so that FDI will contribute to uneven development at different geographic scales. And I think I've tried to explain the unique contribution of economic geographers to research on FDI, because economic geographers understand and analyze FDI in the context of uneven development, which economists tend to overlook as something that is not very important. And also compared to economics, economic geographers have developed this regional approach to FDI. Now, of course, this is a huge topic, FDI, and there are many other research topics that are related to FDI in peripheral regions that economic geographers should study more, such as the importance of disinvestment and reinvestment, which is often more important than new investment. FDI from emerging economies, such as countries such as China, for example. FDI in services is under-researched. FDI in the extractive industry, FDI in agriculture, and also environmental effects of FDI are an important topic that has not been very much researched by economic geographers. So that's all from me. I'm sorry for taking so much time. Thank you for your attention, and I'm ready to answer any questions and react to any comments. Thank you.
Jonathan?
Yeah, hi.
Moving to the question, Jonathan.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, very well. Thank you very much for a really informative talk. And your concluding points, to me, really resonate because I'm a political scientist who studies and teaches global political economy. So a lot of overlap with what you said, but having the economic geographer's perspective it adds a very interesting dimension. Those of us in political science, political economy, who've been talking about core and periphery for decades, tend not to think about it in spatial or geographic terms. But I do have a question, or kind of a speculation. Another distinction that we usually make between types of FDI is between greenfields investments and mergers and acquisitions. And I was wondering if the different types might track with what you observe about the inequality effects, because I'm just intuitively, it would seem that the best targets, the most attractive acquisitions, or the best potential partners for big multinational corporations would be in the more developed areas of peripheral countries or in the core, so that you would see more merger and acquisition there, and maybe more greenfields in less developed areas, especially when we're talking about extractive industries.
Yeah, I agree with that. Of course, mergers and acquisitions would be more typical for more developed countries and core regions, where basically there are firms developed, maybe domestic firms that might be a target for these mergers and acquisitions. While in less developed regions, in peripheral regions, and in less developed countries, you don't have, or there are not so many opportunities to acquire domestic firms, right? Also, an interesting point that you have raised, basically related to this, is that, of course, these different types of FDI will also have different kind of developmental effects. It is much more likely, of course, that a greenfield investment will lead to the creation of new jobs and more jobs than mergers and acquisitions. Mergers and acquisitions can actually lead to job cuts because of rationalization. And so, in a way, mergers and acquisitions can have kind of negative labor market effects.
Right.
In host economies.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank Dr. Pavlinek giving this great comprehensive review of FDI impacts on uneven development and inequality. So my question is, you're talking about the different linkages, like development linkages, and also the dependent linkages and detrimental linkages. So it seems for the development linkages is more like a core regions is more horizontal, happens in horizontal linkages, and for the vertical and for the dependent and the vertical, dependent and the detrimental linkages is more from the vertical linkages. So based on your research in Europe also, what's the successful, is there or successful experience for this vertical linkages in periphery regions could be development linkages instead of dependent or detrimental linkages, especially for auto industrial you studied.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Well, basically, it is important that these host economies have capable domestic firms, right, that could basically act as partners for foreign firms and foreign subsidiaries. So I think one of the basic preconditions for the development of these developmental linkages would be, the existence of the strong domestic economy and the existence of strong domestic firms. Now, the problem in many less developed countries and also in peripheral regions is that the governments would focus on attracting foreign investors, and they would offer them very large incentives to come and invest, and basically would not provide the same level of support to domestic firms. If you look at the historic experience of countries such as Taiwan, South Korea, but you also see it in China today, the governments of these countries did not focus solely on foreign investors, but they also strongly supported the development and growth of domestic firms, so that these domestic firms can act as partners for foreign investors, right? And basically, this would lead to the development of kind of more equitable partnerships rather than being in a dependent position, being used as a cheap supplier and not really benefiting very much from that. Now, in the case of China, for example, as I'm sure you know, until very recently, foreign automakers were not allowed to build 100% foreign-owned factories. These always had to be joint ventures with the domestic firms in order to ensure these linkages and spillovers, that knowledge will be transferred basically from these foreign companies to domestic firms. So the focus is on the growth and development of domestic firms, some of which might then globalize and basically can compete globally and won't be no longer dependent on foreign firms. But this is a long-term strategy. It's a difficult strategy to follow, and there are not many countries that have been able to follow these strategies. They have to have strong industrial policies, strong support for domestic firms, but there are countries that have been able to achieve that. South Korea, Taiwan, nowadays China. So there are examples of that. But it did not happen in countries of Eastern Europe. It's not happening in Mexico. So in most of less developed countries, these policies are not, industrial policies are not pursued by the governments.
Okay, so when you say it's not pursued by government, what you are saying is, so what I understand you are saying is the government should be interview or regulate this FDI from the very beginning for these FDI policies. So then they can actually have, you mentioned the coupling of the regional assets and also the foreign companies, they are capital or resources. So how did you see this embedded or in which stage actually the government's roles change during different period of times?
During different, I'm sorry.
Different stage of times.
Yeah, so again, drawing on the historical experience of these successful countries, right? If you look at Taiwan and its electronics industry in the 1960s and 1970s, it was first dominated by American firms and American investment. But over time, the government supported the growth of domestic firms in this sector. And these firms were basically also benefiting from the presence of foreign firms. And through, strong industrial policy, they were allowed to grow and eventually globalize. So eventually American firms basically left Taiwan and invested somewhere else. But the domestic sector benefited in a way from these foreign investors but was allowed to grow and prosper and eventually globalize. So I think FDI can be beneficial if it is channeled to strategic sectors, and if at the same time the governments support also the development of domestic firms that could benefit from foreign direct investment. But again, there must be domestic firms, there must have absorptive capacity, and over time they can grow and develop and even globalize. But again, it is a long-term journey, a long-term process that for most countries is very difficult to follow, because it's not as straightforward as opening up, as East European automotive industry. Please come in, build factories, we'll give you large investment incentives, and this will help the auto industry to survive. But it is successful, but it has, high costs. The auto industry of these countries is totally dependent on foreign capital, and it suffers from all the problems I've been talking about. Value transfer, profit repatriation, the lack of high value added functions, or it's not complete absence, but much lower share of these functions than in core regions. So basically all these processes then maintain the peripheral position of some countries and regions. Even with high levels of FDI, they continue to be dependent on foreign corporations and foreign capital, which I think is a long-term development problem leading to the inability of these countries to catch up with more developed countries and the core regions.
So then, based on your just now in the talk, and also you explained since the absorptive abilities of the local regions will determine these knowledge or technology transfer and contribute to the long-term development, local development. So then how do you see for like different regions, they can use their resources or their advantages to achieve this absorptive capacity?
Well, the basic idea, of the global protection network perspective is that the regions should basically develop and cultivate particular regional assets that might attract foreign investors, so lead to strategic coupling, right? But the idea is not to be coupled in what is known as the structural coupling, because structural coupling will lead to basically this subordinate position, dependent position on foreign capital, and will have limited effects for economic development. I'm not trying to say that, investment will not have these short-term effects I've been talking about. It will create jobs, it will bring in capital. It will have effects on GDP, which will be positive. But the problem is that in the long run, there will be transfer of profits, the transfer of value, there will be dependent position, and uneven development as the outcome, an inability of these regions to catch up with more developed regions or core regions, right? So people would call it middle income, the middle income trap. There are different ways to describe this, but the outcome will be the continuing kind of peripheral position or less developed position than in the case of core regions. So the idea would be, again, you need to develop these particular assets that will attract higher value added type of activities, research and development, other innovation activities, service type of activities rather than production of standardized goods. But as I was trying to explain, this is difficult to achieve because it requires long-term investment in, for example, education policies, institutional reforms, and these have quite uncertain outcomes. So it requires basically long-term strategy of economic development in which FDI may play an important role. But these regions should not become dependent on FDI, right? So the idea of this long-term strategy is to develop these regional assets that would attract higher quality FDI. But I think it would be unreasonable to expect that all peripheral regions and or less developed countries can follow this type of strategy. I think it's I think it is impossible. So some countries might be successful in doing this, but if you look back in the past 60, 70 years, there was only a handful of countries that have been really successful and were able to kind of advance or move from, the periphery to semi-periphery or even the core of the world economy. So this process is very difficult to achieve.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with that. So then what do you see so which means what you're explain is very dependent on the local and the regional context and also its long-term strategies. So how do you see the geographers' role in this development process research? Since as you mentioned that do you see some successful experiences make applying to other countries? So as just now you mentioned Taiwan has a successful experience for this help FDI to move up the global value chain in this global production network. And also, especially for the knowledge and the technology transfer to lead to the economic development and growth. So I think as you mentioned, like China's case, so for this, in order to have this development linkages to have more technology transfer and also knowledge transfer. So China has the regulations is more for the technology, the strategies is more, since China's resources is large market, so have the use the market to exchange for technology from the government regulations. So how did you see, since you currently work on also, how did you see this can be used for large population countries?
Well, I think that it is extremely difficult to replicate the experience of one country in another country, because, for example, if we talk about China, it is in a very unique position because the government controls access to potentially the largest market in the world. And it gives the government of China a lot of power in terms of its relationship to foreign investors. Foreign companies want to invest in China because they want to access this market. So in terms of the bargaining power, China is in a very unique position. Not many countries around the world are in the same position. And if you think about, especially smaller countries and smaller economies, the governments have typically very weak or much weaker bargaining position with respect to FDI. So while the Chinese government can impose all kinds of regulations on foreign investors, and they would basically comply with those regulations because they want to either invest or stay in China in the market. If a small country, let's say Slovakia, decides to impose these or similar regulations on foreign investors, they will leave Slovakia, they will move their production, next door to Hungary or to Poland or to Czechia, whatever. These are countries that have similar factor endowments, small markets, big governments with respect to foreign capital or foreign investors. So these countries are in a much, much weaker position to bargain with very powerful transnational corporations. So that's one thing. Another thing that is very important is basically that it is difficult to replicate some of the experiences because some of the policies and approaches are embedded in culture of a particular country, which cannot be easily replicated. I recently reviewed a book about South Korean Hyundai for economic geography. And this book was very revealing because, Hyundai is a success story. It's a automaker from originally less developed countries that really made it among the top 5 largest automakers in the world. 40 years ago, or 50 years ago, the company was very weak, an only local company. Now it's a global company. But after reading the book, it became clear to me that the experience of Hyundai would be almost impossible to replicate in any other country around the world because it has been deeply embedded in the South Korean culture, business culture, the way of doing business, the way they treat, workers, the way they treat the suppliers, the governmental policies, all of that combined is very unique. And this experience would be very difficult to replicate anywhere else, I think.
So geographers are important to study each
Yes.
case.
Well, because economists would tend to kind of generalize. They basically do not consider these local or regional factors as being very important. They are more interested in kind of more general theory, in generalizations and theory. But the problem is that these generalizations and theories are very often kind of detached from what is really happening on the ground. And so as a theory, it is nice, but in reality, if you try to apply to specific conditions, it's difficult to apply because very often it doesn't work as theorized.
Okay, thank you so much to give me the excellent presentation and also the responses. And also, usually we give applause to speakers, great talks. So then also thanks all the participants. So thank you.